The spring of 2026 was meant to be a time of renewal along the Danube River. As the first light of dawn touched the water, the countryside seemed to promise hope and new beginnings. For centuries, the Danube had been the lifeblood of the region, nurturing fields, forests, and the communities that lined its banks. People looked forward to the gentle return of warmth, the blossoming of wildflowers, and the steady rhythm of river life. Instead, relentless rains turned the river into a churning, debris-filled monster. Day after day, dark clouds gathered overhead, unleashing torrents that showed no sign of stopping. The Danube, usually calm and predictable, became wild and unpredictable, its surface littered with broken branches, uprooted trees, and the remnants of daily life swept away by the current. Water rose steadily, swallowing villages and farmland with cold indifference. Fields that once promised harvests disappeared beneath muddy waves, and entire communities found themselves isolated, cut off from the world by the relentless advance of the floodwaters. Old-timers admitted they'd never seen anything like it. Some recalled stories from their grandparents about floods long ago, but nothing compared to the scale and speed of this disaster. The river, they said, seemed to have a mind of its own, defying all attempts to predict or control it. Sirens wailed in the night, urging evacuations, but many hesitated to leave their homes. Memories, possessions, and the comfort of familiarity held them back, even as the threat grew with every passing hour. Emergency crews worked tirelessly, moving from house to house and buying ponder, pleading with residents to seek safety. The river did not wait. Water burst through windows, transforming streets into canals. In a matter of hours, neighborhoods were unrecognizable, with cars submerged and people forced to wade through waist-deep water, clutching whatever they could carry. Modern flood defenses in cities like Budapest and Bratislava were pushed to their limits. Engineers and volunteers worked side by side, stacking sandbags and reinforcing levees, but the sheer volume of water was overwhelming. In some places, barriers held. In others, they crumbled under the pressure. The Danube, once a symbol of beauty, became an adversary, holding nations captive. Iconic landmarks vanished beneath the flood, and the river's roar echoed through empty streets, a constant reminder of nature's power. As days passed, the scale of the disaster became clear. Vast inland seas replaced towns and fields. From the air, the landscape was transformed. Rooftops poked above the water, and roads disappeared, leaving only the memory of what once was. The Danube Deluge of 2026 was no longer local. It was a continental crisis. News reports flashed images of devastation across Europe, and maps showed the growing reach of the floodwaters, affecting millions from Germany to the Black Sea. It marked the beginning of a season of wild weather that would test the resilience of millions. Families clung to hope as they salvaged what they could, while volunteers and emergency workers formed a lifeline, bringing food, shelter, and comfort to those in need. The river's awakening was only the prelude to even greater chaos to come. As storm clouds gathered once more, the people of the Danube knew their struggle was far from over, and that the true test of their endurance was just beginning. The Danube flood was no accident. This was not a random act of nature, but the result of a complex interplay of atmospheric forces that had been building for weeks, even months. It was the result of a rare convergence of weather patterns, a perfect storm of meteorological events that aligned with devastating precision. A blocking high-pressure system over the North Atlantic acted like an invisible wall, trapping storm systems and preventing them from moving westward. Instead, these storms were funneled directly into Central and Eastern Europe, bringing relentless pounding rain day after day. At the same time, record snowfall in the Alps melted with unusual speed, sending torrents of icy water rushing into the Danube's tributaries. This surge arrived just as the rains reached their peak, compounding the disaster. The ground, already saturated from weeks of previous rainfall, could absorb no more. Fields turned into lakes, and waterlogged soil offered no resistance to the rising floodwaters. Unusually warm Mediterranean waters added even more energy to the storms, fueling their intensity and making each downpour heavier and more destructive than the last. Meteorologists called it an atmospheric river, a vast, invisible corridor of moisture stretching thousands of kilometers, aimed directly at the heart of Europe. This river in the sky delivered a continuous supply of rain, overwhelming the land below. The Danube's flow shattered all previous records. Century-old river gauges, which had stood through generations of floods, were now completely submerged. their measurements rendered meaningless by the sheer scale of the deluge. Flood defenses, no matter how advanced or well-maintained, were simply overwhelmed. Levees broke, barriers failed, and water spilled into towns and cities with unstoppable force. This was more than a flood. It was a complete reconfiguration of the region's water cycle. The Danube carved new paths across the landscape, creating new floodplains and altering the course of the river itself. The event was a stark illustration of a climate system under stress, a warning sign that the patterns we once relied on are shifting in unpredictable ways. Scientists scrambled to analyze the data, searching for answers in a world where the old rules no longer apply. Old certainties were washed away by new, dangerous realities. Infrastructure that had stood for decades was destroyed in days, and entire communities were left abandoned, surrounded by water. The weather had become unpredictable, and the consequences were catastrophic. For the people living along the Danube, the flood was not just a natural disaster, it was a wake-up call, a reminder that our relationship with the climate is changing, and that we must adapt to survive. The Danube's rising waters were relentless, surging over embankments and swallowing the familiar landscapes of Eastern Europe. What began as a slow, steady rise soon became a torrent, overwhelming the defenses that had protected these communities for generations. The floodwaters brought devastation to communities along its banks, turning vibrant neighborhoods into ghostly, waterlogged ruins. Streets that once echoed with laughter and daily life were now eerily silent, submerged beneath muddy currents. Generations-old homes were destroyed, their walls crumbling under the force of the water. Family photographs, heirlooms, and cherished memories were swept away in moments, leaving families to salvage what little they could from the wreckage. Infrastructure collapsed, roads buckled, bridges snapped, and railways twisted out of shape. Power grids failed, plunging entire towns into darkness and isolating them from the outside world, making rescue and relief efforts even more difficult. Clean water became scarce as treatment plants and wells were contaminated by the flood. Residents lined up for hours at emergency water stations, worried about disease and desperate for basic necessities. Emergency services struggled to reach those in need, navigating flooded streets by boat. Every rescue was a race against time, as stranded families waited anxiously for help to arrive. The economic toll soared. Businesses were submerged, factories closed indefinitely, and vast stretches of farmland were ruined. Livelihoods vanished overnight, leaving uncertainty about how communities would recover. Thousands crowded into temporary shelters, sharing what little comfort they had. Families huddled together, supporting one another through sleepless nights filled with worry and fear for the future. The elderly and vulnerable relied on rescue boats for food, water, and medicine. Volunteers braved dangerous conditions to deliver supplies, their efforts a lifeline for those unable to leave their homes. Anxiety and uncertainty weighed heavily on everyone. Each day brought new questions. When would the waters recede, and what would be left behind? The fear of losing everything lingered in every anxious glance. The flood was not just physical destruction, it was a psychological crisis. The trauma of displacement, loss, and the unknown future left deep emotional scars. As neighbors leaned on each other for comfort and hope, pollution from oil, pesticides, and sewage created a toxic soup, threatening long-term health. The environmental damage would linger, affecting drinking water, crops, and wildlife for months or even years to come. The cleanup would last long after the waters retreated. Volunteers and residents worked side by side, clearing mud, debris, and ruined belongings, determined to rebuild their lives from the ground up. The Danube Deluge was a stark reminder that a river's flood brings a cascade of consequences, physical, economic, and emotional. Yet amid the devastation, the resilience and solidarity of these communities shone through, offering hope for recovery and renewal. Beyond the human tragedy, the Danube's ecosystem suffered a silent disaster. Floodplains and wetlands, home to diverse wildlife, were overwhelmed by fast-moving, polluted water. Nests and habitats were destroyed. Fish populations suffered massive die-offs. Toxic chemicals settled into the sediment, poisoning the food chain for years to come. Even protected areas like the Danube Delta were inundated with debris and contaminants. The flood left behind sterile, contaminated silt, smothering plant life. The intricate web of life along the Danube was torn apart, and recovery would be slow. The deluge was a brutal lesson in the fragility of even the most resilient ecosystems. As the floods raged, the atmosphere unleashed another shock tornadoes. Violent twisters struck southern Poland, the Czech Republic, and western Ukraine, regions unaccustomed to such storms. Warm, moist air from the Mediterranean collided with cold, dry air from the north, creating extreme instability. Several tornadoes reached EF3 strength, carving paths of destruction through villages and farmland. The surprise was devastating. Warnings were brief, and most homes lacked shelters. Communities reeled from this new violent threat. Nature had delivered a brutal 1-2 punch: water and wind. Amid the wreckage, stories of survival emerged. In a Czech village, John and his family hid in their pantry as the tornado tore off their roof, surviving, but losing everything. First responders described scenes of chaos, digging survivors out by hand. A young woman in Ukraine found a single photograph in the debris, her only link to her past. Families sheltered in bathtubs, mattresses pulled overhead, surviving by seconds and luck. These stories transformed the disaster from headlines to human tragedy. They were reminders of life's fragility and the power of resilience. In shelters, survivors shared their experiences, finding strength in each other. The tales of loss and escape became a crucial part of recovery. They were not just about survival, but about hope and community. In the face of disaster, community spirit shone. Neighbors rescued each other by boat, shared food, and opened homes to the displaced. Volunteer groups and aid organizations mobilized rapidly, providing essentials and comfort. Temporary shelters became hubs of support and solidarity. Firefighters and rescue teams worked tirelessly, often risking their lives. International aid arrived, uniting Europe in a common cause. The crisis transcended borders, proving the power of compassion and cooperation. Helpers, from neighbors to international workers, became symbols of hope. In the darkest times, humanity's best qualities emerged. As waters receded and debris was cleared, rebuilding began. The scale of damage demanded a new approach. Simply restoring the past was not enough. Authorities embraced making room for the river, restoring floodplains and relocating high-risk communities. Building codes were updated for flood and tornado resistance. Investments in early warning systems and public education became priorities. Tornado-resistant designs and community shelters were considered for the first time. The disasters forced a fundamental shift in how communities prepared for nature's power. Rebuilding was slow and challenging, but resilience took root. The focus was on transformation, creating a safer, more adaptable future. The lessons of 2026 were being learned. The Danube deluge and tornadoes were more than bad weather. They were warnings from a stressed planet. Scientists agreed, these events matched climate change predictions. A warmer atmosphere means more extreme rainfall and storms in unexpected places. The disasters brought climate change into sharp human focus. It was no longer abstract or distant. The need for urgent climate action became undeniable. The world must invest in both mitigation and adaptation. Resilient infrastructure, early warning systems, and ecosystem protection are essential. The survivors' stories are a call to action for a safer, sustainable future. If we ignore these warnings, the wild spring of 2026 will be just the beginning. The time to act is now.